July 1st, 1941, 11:30 hours, Tokyo, Japan. Iva Toguri stood on the dock at Yokohama, watching the SS President Coolidge disappear toward the horizon, carrying the last group of Americans being evacuated from Japan as tensions between the two nations approached the breaking point. She'd come to the dock hoping to find passage back to Los Angeles, but the ship's passenger manifest had been full, and the ticket agent had told her bluntly that no more evacuation ships would be scheduled. She was 25 years old, born in Los Angeles, raised American in every way that mattered, and now stranded in Japan because she'd made the mistake of visiting her sick aunt in July 1941. 3 weeks before the U.S. imposed oil embargoes on Japan, 5 months before Pearl Harbor would transform peaceful visit into wartime imprisonment. She'd planned to stay 6 weeks. She would be trapped in Japan for 4 years, and what happened during those years would make her simultaneously a lifeline for American POWs and a scapegoat for a nation that needed someone to blame for wartime propaganda. Iva walked away from the dock, carrying the small suitcase that contained everything she'd brought from California. She had approximately $200 in American currency that was becoming increasingly worthless as U.S.-Japan relations deteriorated. She spoke limited Japanese, enough for basic conversation but not fluency. She had a college degree in zoology from UCLA that was useless in wartime Tokyo, and she had American citizenship that was about to become her greatest liability. 5 months later, when Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor and America declared war on Japan, Iva Toguri became enemy alien in the country of her parents' birth, too American for Japan and too Japanese for America. The choices she would make during the next 4 years, particularly her secret efforts to feed starving American POWs while working for Radio Tokyo, would save lives and cost her freedom, proving that mercy during wartime often receives punishment rather than gratitude. The stranded American. After Pearl Harbor, Iva's situation became increasingly precarious. The Japanese government required all foreign nationals to register as enemy aliens. Officials pressured her to renounce American citizenship and accept Japanese citizenship, which would have provided legal protection and access to ration cards. She refused repeatedly, insisting she was American and would remain American regardless of where geography had trapped her. The refusal came with severe consequences. Without Japanese citizenship, Iva couldn't receive ration cards for food, clothing, or other necessities that were distributed through government systems. She couldn't work in most occupations that required Japanese citizenship. She lived under constant surveillance as suspected foreign spy. The Kempe Tai, Japanese military police, interrogated her multiple times about her background, her family in America, whether she was gathering intelligence. The practical challenge was survival without legal status, or resources in wartime economy, where everything was rationed and controlled. Iva found work where she could, initially as typist for a Japanese news service that needed someone who could type English, later at Radio Tokyo, where English-language broadcasters were required for propaganda programming directed at Allied audiences. The radio work paid minimally, but provided access to the building and, eventually, to the American POWs who were forced to work there. The POW broadcasters. By 1943, Radio Tokyo had begun using Allied POWs in propaganda broadcasts designed to demoralize American and Allied forces in the Pacific. The prisoners, primarily Americans, Australians, and British, were forced to work in radio studios producing programs that Japanese authorities believed would undermine Allied morale and encourage defeatism. The POW broadcasters worked under guard, lived in prison camps, and survived on inadequate rations that left them malnourished and sick. They were selected partly for their voices, partly for their language skills, and partly because Japanese authorities believed their status as POWs would make them compliant. The reality was more complex. The prisoners cooperated enough to avoid execution while subtly undermining propaganda through tone, word choice, and delivery that suggested they didn't believe what they were reading. The conditions in which POW broadcasters worked were documented in post-war testimonies. Major Charles Cousins, an Australian radio announcer who'd been captured in Singapore and forced to work for Radio Tokyo, described the situation. "We were starving. The Japanese gave us enough food to keep us alive, but not enough to maintain health. Many of us had beriberi, dysentery, and other diseases from malnutrition. We were weak constantly. The work itself wasn't physically demanding, but the psychological pressure of being forced to produce propaganda for the enemy while our comrades were fighting and dying was devastating." Iva Toguri encountered the POW broadcasters when she was assigned to Radio Tokyo as announcer. Her initial role was reading news scripts and introducing musical programs. She had no broadcasting experience, but spoke English fluently with American accent that Japanese producers thought would sound authentic to Allied audiences. The work was uncomfortable. She was reading propaganda for Japan against the country she still considered her own. But refusing would have meant arrest and possibly execution. The secret feeding. Iva recognized immediately that the POW broadcasters were starving. Their gaunt appearance, the way they moved slowly to conserve energy, the fact that they'd focus intensely on any food that appeared in the studio, all indicated severe malnutrition. She began bringing extra food from her own limited rations and secretly passing it to the prisoners when guards weren't watching. The feeding started small. Rice balls wrapped in paper, smuggled into the studio in her bag, and slipped to prisoners during breaks. Pickled vegetables. Occasionally fruit when she could obtain any. The quantities were tiny by normal standards, but significant for men who weren't receiving adequate nutrition. A rice ball containing a few ounces of rice provided hundreds of calories that could mean the difference between functioning and collapsing. The risk was substantial. Japanese authorities treated any assistance to POWs as serious crime that could result in arrest, torture, and execution. The Kempeitai monitored everyone at Radio Tokyo for signs of disloyalty or sabotage. Being caught feeding prisoners would have been interpreted as collaboration with the enemy and dealt with accordingly. But Iva continued bringing food because she couldn't watch men starve when she had resources, however limited, to help. Major Cousins later testified about Iva's assistance. "She brought us food when she could. Not much. She didn't have much herself. But a rice ball or some vegetables when you're starving means everything. She risked her life doing it. If the guards had caught her feeding us, they would have killed her. She knew that, but she did it anyway. She was the only Japanese person at Radio Tokyo who treated us like human beings rather than propaganda tools." The food smuggling expanded as Iva found additional sources. She'd use her small salary to buy food on black markets, where transactions were illegal but available. She'd trade possessions for food she could pass to prisoners. She'd save portions from her own meals, going hungrier herself so prisoners could eat. The systematic assistance over months probably saved lives among POW broadcasters whose malnutrition was severe enough that small additional calories made medical difference. The broadcasts, Iva's work at Radio Tokyo, required her to participate in propaganda broadcasts that were designed to demoralize Allied forces. The zero-hour program featured music, comedy sketches, and commentary that Japanese authorities believed would make Allied soldiers homesick and reluctant to continue fighting. Iva served as announcer and occasional participant in sketches. The broadcasts used the name Tokyo Rose, a generic term that Allied servicemen applied to various female announcers on Japanese radio. rather than specific individual. Multiple women broadcasters worked for Radio Tokyo during the war, but Tokyo Rose became catch-all designation for any female voice on Japanese propaganda radio. Iva was one of several women who filled that role at various times, though post-war she would be singled out as the Tokyo Rose, despite never using that name herself. The propaganda content was relatively harmless. Japanese scriptwriters weren't sophisticated about American culture and produced material that was more amusing than demoralizing. Iva and the POW broadcasters deliberately emphasized the entertainment aspects while minimizing propaganda effectiveness. They'd read scripts in tones that suggested skepticism. They'd insert subtle humor that undermined messages. They'd play music that boosted morale rather than diminishing it. American servicemen who listened to Zero Hour generally enjoyed it as entertainment, rather than being demoralized by it. The music was better than what most armed forces radio could provide. The comedy was unintentionally funny because the cultural misunderstandings produced absurd content. The propaganda was so heavy-handed that listeners recognized it as propaganda and dismissed it. Post-war surveys of veterans who'd heard Zero-Hour broadcasts found that approximately 80% considered them entertaining rather than demoralizing, and approximately 60% believed the broadcasters were actually sympathetic to Allied forces despite being forced to work for Japanese radio. The double life. Throughout her time at Radio Tokyo, Iva maintained precarious double life, publicly working for Japanese propaganda while secretly assisting Allied prisoners. The psychological strain was considerable. She had to appear cooperative enough to avoid suspicion while undermining propaganda effectiveness when possible. She had to feed prisoners secretly while maintaining professional relationships with Japanese staff who would have reported her if they'd known. She had to preserve her American identity internally while presenting acceptable face to authorities who watched for disloyalty. The strain was documented in what little personal correspondence survived the war. In a letter to her family in California that was smuggled out through neutral diplomats, Iva wrote, "I am doing what I must to survive, but I have not forgotten who I am or where I belong. I help where I can, even when helping is dangerous. I am still American, regardless of what anyone here believes or what you might hear about what I am doing. Trust that I remain loyal to what matters." The POW broadcasters who worked with Iva understood her position and protected her as much as they could. They'd create opportunities for her to pass food by asking to speak with her privately about scripts. They'd position themselves to block guards' sightlines when she was handing over food. They'd divert attention when necessary to give her time to complete handoffs. The collaboration was mutual assistance. She helped them survive physically. They helped her survive legally by covering for her assistance. The war's end. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, Iva Toguri experienced a brief period of relief before disaster. She was free from Japanese authority, could potentially return to America, and might resume normal life after 4 years of strain and danger. The American POWs she'd been feeding were liberated and processed for repatriation. Several told their liberators about the Japanese woman who'd helped them, describing her assistance in terms that should have resulted in gratitude. Instead, American occupation authorities began searching for Tokyo Rose as suspected war criminal. Journalists covering the occupation wanted to identify the woman whose voice had been broadcasting Japanese propaganda for years. The story had dramatic elements that would sell newspapers: American woman broadcasting for enemy, exotic nickname, propaganda work that could be portrayed as treason. The fact that multiple women had worked as announcers, that the broadcasts had been relatively harmless, that listeners had found them entertaining rather than demoralizing, none of those complications interfered with narrative that journalists wanted to tell. Iva was arrested on October 17, 1945, identified as one of several women who'd broadcast as Tokyo Rose, and held for interrogation. The initial questioning focused on her citizenship status, whether she'd renounced American citizenship, whether she'd accepted Japanese citizenship, what her legal status was during the war. She maintained she'd remained American citizen throughout, had refused Japanese citizenship offers, and had worked at Radio Tokyo only because she needed employment to survive. The betrayal begins. The arrest initiated betrayal that would consume the next 6 years of Iva's life. Despite initial investigations finding no evidence of treason or deliberate propaganda on her part, despite testimony from liberated POWs describing her assistance to them, despite recordings of her broadcasts showing relatively innocuous content, American authorities and journalists pursued prosecution with determination that seemed disconnected from evidence. The initial investigations recommended against prosecution. Army investigators concluded that Iva had not committed treasonous acts, that her broadcasts were entertainment rather than effective propaganda, and that her assistance to POWs demonstrated loyalty to Allied forces rather than to Japan. The investigators recommended she be allowed to return to America without charges. But political and media pressure demanded prosecution. Journalists had built Tokyo Rose into symbol of wartime treachery, and retracting the narrative would have been embarrassing. The American public, still angry about the war, wanted someone to blame for Japanese propaganda. Iva, as American citizen who'd worked for enemy radio, was convenient target, regardless of whether evidence supported prosecution. The Justice Department reopened the case in 1948 under political pressure to prosecute. New investigators were assigned with apparent mandate to build prosecution case rather than objectively assess evidence. Witnesses were pressured to change testimony. POWs who'd initially described Iva's assistance were asked leading questions designed to elicit statements that could be interpreted as evidence of propaganda work. The investigation's outcome seemed predetermined. The trial. Iva Toguri was indicted for treason on September 25, 1948, 7 years after she'd been stranded in Japan, 3 years after war's end. She was charged with 8 counts of treason based on her broadcasts from Radio Tokyo. The prosecution alleged she'd broadcast propaganda designed to demoralize American forces, had given aid and comfort to the enemy, and had done so with treasonous intent. The trial began on July 5, 1949, in San Francisco. It lasted 3 months and became media spectacle. The proceedings were documented extensively, providing detailed record of what was either justice or persecution depending on perspective. The prosecution case was thin. Recordings of Iva's broadcasts showed relatively innocuous content: music introductions, comedy sketches, news readings that were obviously propaganda, but not particularly effective. The prosecution relied heavily on testimony from 2 witnesses who claimed Iva had made specific broadcasts that supported prosecution theory. Both witnesses later recanted, stating they'd been coerced by FBI agents who'd threatened them with prosecution if they didn't cooperate. The defense presented testimony from multiple POWs who'd worked at Radio Tokyo and described Iva's assistance. Major cousins testified extensively about the food she'd smuggled to prisoners and the risks she'd taken. Other POW broadcasters corroborated the assistance. Several testified that Iva had deliberately undermined propaganda effectiveness by her delivery, and that she'd never expressed support for Japanese war effort. The prosecution countered by arguing that whatever assistance Iva had provided to individual POWs was irrelevant to the question of whether her broadcasts constituted treason. The broadcasts had occurred, she'd been paid for them by Japanese authorities, and intent could be inferred from her willingness to work for enemy radio. The legal theory was questionable, but sufficient for jury instructions. The verdict and sentence. On September 29, 1949, after 13 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted Iva Toguri on one count of treason, specifically that she had broadcast statement that Allied forces had suffered military losses, which was alleged to give aid and comfort to the enemy. The jury acquitted her on 7 other counts. Several jurors later stated they'd felt pressured to convict on at least one count, despite believing the evidence was insufficient. That the lengthy trial and political atmosphere made complete acquittal seem untenable, even if it was legally justified. Judge Michael Roche sentenced Iva to 10 years in federal prison and a $10,000 fine, harsh sentence for conviction based on broadcasting factually accurate statement about military losses. The sentence reflected less the specific crime than the symbolic importance that had been attached to prosecuting Tokyo Rose, regardless of whether the individual prosecuted had actually committed substantive offenses. Iva was incarcerated at Federal Reformatory for Women in Alderson, West Virginia. She served 6 years before being released on January 28, 1956, for good behavior. The imprisonment was documented in prison records that showed she'd been model prisoner who worked in prison library, maintained perfect discipline record, and counted days until release that would allow her to resume life that had been stolen by prosecution. The long fight for justice. After release from prison, Iva lived in Chicago, where her family had relocated from California. She worked in her father's import business, avoided public attention, and lived quietly while maintaining her innocence and hoping for eventual exoneration. The hope seemed unrealistic. Presidential pardons for treason convictions were extraordinarily rare, and the political atmosphere that had driven prosecution hadn't changed significantly. The campaign for justice gained momentum in the 1970s as journalists began investigating the case more carefully. Investigative reporters discovered evidence that had been withheld from defense during trial, found witnesses who'd recanted coerced testimony, and documented FBI misconduct during investigation. The revelations raised serious questions about whether Iva had received fair trial and whether conviction had been product of political pressure rather than legal evidence. Veterans who'd listened to zero-hour broadcasts organized to support Iva's pardon petition. They testified that the broadcasts had been entertaining rather than demoralizing, that Tokyo Rose had been viewed as friend rather than enemy, that the propaganda had been ineffective. Several former POWs wrote statements describing Iva's assistance and arguing that she'd helped Allied forces rather than aiding Japan. The campaign culminated in petition for presidential pardon filed in 1976. The petition documented trial irregularities, presented evidence that had been unavailable during original proceedings, and argued that justice demanded correction of wrongful conviction. The petition was supported by veterans organizations, civil rights groups, and journalists who'd investigated the case. The pardon. On January 19, 1977, his last full day in office, President Gerald Ford granted Iva Toguri full and unconditional pardon for her treason conviction. The pardon didn't address guilt or innocence directly, but acknowledged that substantial doubts existed about whether justice had been served by prosecution and conviction. Ford's statement accompanying the pardon noted that Iva had served her sentence and that clemency is warranted based on her personal situation. The pardon restored Iva's civil rights and removed the legal stigma of treason conviction, but it didn't restore the years she'd lost to imprisonment or repair damage to her reputation. She was 60 years old when pardoned, had spent 6 years in prison, and had lived nearly 30 years under cloud of treason conviction. The justice came too late to undo most of the harm that wrongful prosecution had caused. Iva's response to the pardon was characteristically understated. In a brief statement, she said, "I am grateful to President Ford and to everyone who worked for justice in my case. I have always maintained my innocence, and I am pleased that I have been pardoned. But I would have preferred that the trial had never happened, that I had been allowed to return home without being prosecuted for helping prisoners and working for survival during wartime. The quiet remainder. After receiving her pardon, Iva Toguri lived quietly in Chicago for another 29 years. She granted occasional interviews to journalists researching the Tokyo Rose case, but generally avoided public attention. She maintained that she'd done nothing wrong during the war, that she'd helped American POWs rather than harming American forces, and that her prosecution had been miscarriage of justice driven by political pressure rather than legal merit. She died on September 26, 2006, at age 90, survived by family who'd supported her throughout ordeal that had defined much of her adult life. Her obituaries finally told the full story, not just the prosecution and conviction, but the assistance she'd provided to POWs, the food she'd smuggled at risk of execution, the years she'd spent in prison for helping the men she was later accused of betraying. The veterans who'd known her broadcasts and the POWs she'd helped wrote tributes describing what she'd meant to them. They emphasized that Tokyo Rose had been friend rather than enemy, that the broadcasts had boosted morale rather than undermining it, and that Iva Toguri had sacrificed her freedom to help prisoners who needed assistance. The tributes provided closure that legal proceedings had never achieved, recognition from the people who actually mattered that she'd been on the right side, despite everything that had happened to her.